So I chose to do my 6-minute talk on expansion valves. Saw a pretty deep video on it. It seemed they explained it really well and kind of helped me understand what they are, so I want to share it with you guys. So what is the purpose of an expansion valve? So the purpose of an expansion valve is to regulate the flow of refrigerant into the evaporator. Essentially what this does down the road is it protects the compressor by not allowing liquid to enter the compressor. So that's the function of an expansion valve. The principal mechanics behind expansion valves is essentially they run off of an open loop system. So they get a feedback from the entrance to the compressor, with the suction line to the compressor. They read the temperature there. That sends a signal, either mechanical or electrical, to the expansion valve, which changes the flow of refrigerant, which then affects that temperature again as the process continues. So it makes this loop. So you see suction line, expansion valve, changes the flow, changes the temperature of the suction line. So that's how the 10,000 foot view of how they work. What are the main types of expansion valves that are used in industry? 3 types are pilot operated, thermal, and electric. Now, the first 2 operate off of mechanical thermal concepts. The third, as you can tell, is electrical. So a pilot operated control, this expansion valve you can see circled in red with the number 1 is the pilot expansion valve, and the larger one, this big black part circled with the number 2 is the main expansion valve. Now the pilot expansion valve actually controls the main expansion valve. We'll see how that happens on the next slide. So what we can see is on the lower part of the left picture is the pilot expansion valve. The curved black line is the diaphragm. The 2 vertical lines off of that diaphragm are the push rods. As that diaphragm moves, those push rods push on the spring you can see at the very bottom, which opens the valve that lets refrigerant in from the condenser. Now, what moves the diaphragm? This is the thermal control that we see with the expansion valve. Looking at this top picture here, that's a thermal bulb. This line right here is the same pink line that runs to the top of the expansion valve. This thermal bulb has refrigerant in it. That's strapped to the suction line into the compressor. So as that line starts to get really hot, the refrigerant expands and pushes down that capillary tube and puts pressure on that diaphragm, which then pushes down that spring to let refrigerant flow into the evaporator. Or, well, excuse me, in this instance with the pilot operated, it's letting refrigerant flow into the main expansion valve, which then pushes on that other spring you can see to release that valve and allow the main valve to operate. So that's how a pilot operated control works. The next type is a thermal control. And essentially it's exactly the same thing as a pilot operated, you just don't have the main valve. So it runs off of exactly the same principles. It has a thermal bulb strapped to the suction line that puts pressure on this diaphragm to let refrigerant from the condenser to the evaporator. It just doesn't have the main valve. So it's exactly the same concept. And then the final type of expansion valve is electronic control. Now the way electronic control is different is it's not using the thermal properties of refrigerant to open the valve. It's actually just taking a electronic temperature and pressure reading at the suction line of the compressor, which tells the controller to actuate this rod here, which is the valve. And so as the controller is calibrated to know, what temperature and pressure we need to open the valve and let more refrigerant into the evaporator. So that's how an electronic expansion valve works. They're more effective. This is actually the best kind, more expensive, but they can control more precisely because it's electrical. So in conclusion, what do we learn? First, we learned the purpose of expansion valves, and that's to regulate the flow of refrigerant into the evaporator to protect our compressors from having liquid run through them. And then the 3 types of expansion valves that are most commonly used are pilot operated, thermal, and electronic.